Good afternoon. We're just waiting for people to join in. So we'll just give a few minutes. Waiting for people to join in. We'll give a few minutes and probably start at 10 past 12. So please be patient while we wait. Thank you. So 2 more minutes. We'll just give 2 more minutes. Just wait for a few more people and then we'll start. I'm watching the attendance. Okay, we'll start shortly. A minute. Yes, good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. Welcome. We're just giving a few minutes for others to join. We'll be starting shortly. We're just waiting in the next, I'm waiting 12:15, we're starting. We'll start at 12:15. Just hold on. Let's give others a chance to join so we don't leave anyone behind. Okay, 2 minutes to go. One minute. Okay, so we can start. I believe we can start while we're waiting While others join, we can start. All right, I will share my screen and then we would commence. Please confirm you can hear me while I am. Confirm you can hear me, please. Yes, thank you. Give me 1 minute. So, welcome, welcome, welcome. Just a second, please. Yeah, we can now go on. Please confirm you can see my screen before I proceed. Confirm you can see my screen. Okay, thank you. Yeah, got it. Thank you. All right, welcome everyone. If you have any questions, comments, please put it in the chat, and then if you can't hear me, then you need to either, go log out and log back in. Thank you. Please, can everyone confirm they can hear me before I comment so that, oh, I think I'm muted. Please confirm you can hear me. Thank you. All right, thank you. So welcome to this masterclass. We're going to have 3 modules. We will start with, so why is this masterclass important? Why does it matter? Why are you here? If you attended the last session on the career coaching and mentoring, you would have gathered that one of the important requirements to build your career in the industry is to gain knowledge. To gain knowledge. So you coming here is not a mistake. It's not a mistake. It's an avenue to build your skills, build your knowledge, and continue, because it's a continuous process. It's a continuous process. So continue building your skills and knowledge in this area, in the energy industry, which is made up of different facets and components. So electricity is often described as the backbone of modern economics, and we can all understand why that is the case. Every aspect of our lives, from healthcare to education, manufacturing, communication, transport, digital services, you name it, depends on reliable and affordable electricity. Yet, as we know, especially in Africa, electricity remains one of the most highly regulated sectors and scarce resource for meeting the needs of communities, citizens, and the likes. So unlike most goods and services, so at the end, the learning objectives, you will understand why electricity is different from other industries, the value chain, key institutions, why regulations exist for this first module, because we'll be having 3 modules, like I mentioned. So, unlike most goods and services, electricity cannot be stored economically at scale. So it has to be delivered instantaneously through what we call interconnected networks that connect to one another. And it relies on infrastructure that requires substantial long-term investment. It's very capital intensive. So what this means is that electricity markets cannot function effectively without appropriate legal and regulatory frameworks. This class introduces participants to the legal, institutional, and economic principles that guide and underpin electricity markets. So we will not be focusing on any particular country's legislation. The master class looks at it holistically, looking at universal concepts that shape electricity regulation across jurisdictions. And that's the beauty about electricity. The principles apply across board. So by the end, you should understand not only how electricity systems operate, but why regulation is central to ensuring reliable service, attracting investment, and protecting consumers, and of course, supporting the energy transition. So why does electricity matter? Why does it matter at all? So it's much more than a commodity. Think of electricity as an essential public service that underpins economic development and social welfare. So there's a difference between electricity and reliable electricity. Because if you have reliable electricity, it means you are able to foster industrial production, you can support digital economies, you can power hospitals and schools, improve quality of life. But on the other side, where there is unreliable electricity, that is where you see increased business costs, it discourages investments, and it limits economic growth. So for governments, electricity policy is closely linked to broader development objectives. So you will notice that where governments create electricity policies, the attendant effect is not just tied to the electricity industry. It has broader development objectives around increasing the welfare of the social welfare of the economy, building more infrastructure, health considerations, etc. So universal access, affordability, reliability, and sustainability are common goals reflected in national energy policy. So if you go to your country's energy policy, you will see some of these objectives and even the international development agendas. So in your own country, on your own, when you have the time, try to identify sectors that would cease functioning without electricity. So you will see that almost every sector will cease to function without electricity. So electricity is really important. And why is it different? So electricity possesses characteristics that distinguishes it from other goods and services. For example, you have to balance supply and demand at all times continuously. It must be balanced at all times, which is why I said it cannot be stored economically. So it's instantaneous, so you must balance supply and demand every second. That is on a second basis. So you can imagine how much work goes into that. It cannot easily be stored. It requires interconnected infrastructure, which entails high upfront capital investment, as I mentioned. Any failure can have immediate and widespread economic and social consequences. So I don't know if you've experienced what we call a blackout in your country, where the grid collapses. you can imagine that the consequences of that. Just try to imagine what happens, schools, hospitals, a lot of things. Although, of course, we have people who have captive and are generating their own electricity, but imagine the impact. So decisions often involve balancing commercial efficiency. So the government has to always balance commercial efficiency. Investors have to gain their return on investment alongside public policy objectives to make sure that electricity is affordable for the citizens. So this explains why governments establish specialized legal and regulatory frameworks for electricity markets rather than just relying on general competition law. If you look into your country's legislation, you will see that it's specialized. There is always a specialized legislation for electricity. So we look at the value chain. If you look at this, so within this value chain, each segment influences legal design. So in generation where electricity is produced, I'm sure you've heard of electricity generation. That is where electricity is produced, generated from different sources. Electricity is produced. You have different actors within that chain. You have generators, you have the system operator, you have market participants. You go on to, because it's in generation where you have the wholesale market, and we'll talk about that as we go along. So generation, electricity is produced from conventional and renewable sources. Conventional sources means oil and gas. The conventional are fossil-based sources and renewable sources. Generation is typically subject to licensing, so you can't just wake up and build a power plant. No. You need to get the relevant permits, the relevant licenses, environmental approvals. You need to put in place contractual arrangements like a power purchase agreement to make sure that there is somebody who can offtake the power that will be produced. Then you have transmission, which consists of high voltage networks, and it entails high voltage transport of electricity over long distances, because it will be uneconomical to duplicate the networks. So the transmission network consists of high voltage bulk transport and is typically regulated as a natural monopoly for public interest purposes. Security reasons, public interest purposes, transmission is a natural monopoly, which means it's not open for investment, it's not open to competition. But these days, we are now seeing governments amending their laws to accommodate private investment in transmission. While it should be government-owned, the government are now allowing investment in transmission. Then you have distribution, where distribution companies, I'm sure you've heard of discos in your country, it may be a different terminology. In Nigeria, you have different discos, Eko Disco, Ikeja Disco. Those distribution companies, they deliver electricity to consumers through lower voltage network. So they cannot, when the electricity goes from transmission, it is stepped down at a certain kV to, I think, about 11 or 33 kV to a lower voltage to allow that electricity to be distributed to households. So here the regulation focuses on service quality, network investment, metering, technical standards, etc. You then have retail, which is supply. This stage entails suppliers interfacing directly with customers, managing. So in Nigeria, for example, you have distribution and supply as one. You are interfacing with your disco because the disco is also the retail end. In the UK, it's not that way. You have your electricity service providers, the retail end. They interface directly with the customers. They manage billing, they handle customer service. And then if retail competition is permitted, there is a market for that. So across the value chain, the legal issues differ, but together they make up an integrated system. I call it back to back, end to end. So there needs to be coordinated governance. We've talked about generation, so I will not go into that. We've talked about transmission. If you look at this diagram, you see that for distribution, you see that the high voltage starts at 132 kV. It then moves to, there's also 66 for regional transmission. But then when you are now going into sub-transmission, you have to step it down for large distribution to 33 kV and then for households to 11 kV. You can research more on that on your own. With distribution, we've talked about this as well. And then supply, we've talked about this as well. We'll then move on to who are the key participants. Effective now, electricity markets depend upon clearly defined institutional roles. So if you have the minister interfering with what should be the independent regulator's role, there will be problems. So you have different participants, you have the government, you have the regulators, you have utilities, private investors, consumers, and so on. So governments establish the policy direction and legislative framework. Independent regulators, they implement legislation. Don't mix it up. Independent regulators implement legislation. They issue licenses. They approve tariffs. They monitor compliance levels. And another key role they play is to protect consumers. So the utilities, they own and operate the network infrastructure. So the distribution companies and the likes. Then you have the independent power producers who are private developers who develop generation projects. Then the consumers finance the system. The reason how the consumers finance the system. So I always tell people the value chain works the other way. So it's not generation down. So this value chain that I spoke about, it works this way. It works from consumer down to generation because the consumer is the one that is financing the system through tariffs. And in return for that, they get reliable service. So institutional clarity promotes accountability. So you see that each person knows what they're responsible for, who they are accountable to. It reduces duplication. The minister will not be performing the role of the regulator. Consumers will not be performing the role of private investors. It improves investor confidence. When the investor can see that, okay, the government is not interfering in the regulator's role, it increases confidence. Why does regulation exist? Why does it exist? It exists because electricity markets cannot always produce socially desirable outcomes on their own. They cannot produce those outcomes on their own. So it addresses natural monopoly characteristics so that way, if your structure is built on that, you maintain that requirement. It protects consumers because without regulation, how are the consumers protected? How are their rights enforced? It encourages investment. It establishes technical standards because the grid and all other attendant investments have to run based on codes, standards, and rules. It ensures that market participants comply with legal obligations. So a well-designed regulatory framework will balance competing objectives. It has to balance it. And those objectives are affordability, reliability. So while the electricity has to be affordable, the service has to be reliable. Can it be financially sustained? That is where a regulatory framework comes in. And then it has to cater to long-term investment to ensure that there is investment certainty. So in Africa, our reality is that there is growing demand as the population, so there's a correlation between the size of the population, GDP, and demand. There is growing demand. There is a clear infrastructure gap, otherwise 600 million people will not be without electricity. Utilities need to be reformed, and there is need for private investment because the government cannot handle it on their own. So key takeaways from this module: electricity markets are not normal markets. They are not normal markets. Regulation is unavoidable. It has to be regulated. So understanding the structure is the foundation for law and pricing. So we will take a mini discussion. You can type your answers in the chat. What happens if there's no regulator? What happens? You can put your answers in the chat. You can put your answers in the chat. What happens if there's no regulator? Think about that and put your answers in the chat. You just give about 2 minutes, think through it based on everything you've heard. If there's no regulator, what then happens? Of course, you have a chaotic market. And it's the same thing I say with this creation of state electricity markets in Nigeria. If you do not have coordination at the federal and state level, it's going to be chaotic. You are going to have so many markets duplicating each other's objectives. Yes, imbalance between the competing interests. Of course, investors will not be interested. They will not be interested. There will be reduced competition, yes, due to monopolistic practices. Pricing, of course, will be impacted. If there's no regulator, you can imagine that it will be arbitrary. Developers and independent power producers will put a price as they deem fit, which will create arbitrage. So consumer expectation exactly. Consumers will be unnecessarily exploited. The market will be abused. In fact, there will be no market because it will just be chaotic. So thank you for those contributions. We'll move on. So we're moving on to module 2. If you have any questions, put it in the chat. We'll take it at the end of the masterclass. So in MM, can you put the full acronym, please? LASEC is the Lagos State Electricity Regulatory Commission. I'll take that question at the end. So yes, there won't be technical standards, poor standards from the developers, of course. Likelihood that competition encourages unfair consumer practices. It will prejudice the interests of core public services, of course. Thank you so much. So we'll move to the next module. Who governs electricity markets? It's important to know and delineate this so that you would be able to understand each stakeholder's role within the electricity value chain. It's important to delineate this consideration. Who governs the electricity market? So for this module 2, at the end of the module, you should understand the legal architecture of electricity markets. You should be able to distinguish between governments, regulators, and utilities. I know it sounds like why wouldn't I know? But trust me, when it comes to the performance of the roles, there is usually overlap. So you should understand how to distinguish between government regulators and utilities. You should be able to explain electricity market structures, understand licensing and regulatory oversight, and appreciate why regulatory credibility matters. So why does governance matter in the electricity market? So electricity markets are governed through a hierarchy of legal instruments. We would see that when we move on to, I believe it's the legal architecture. So governance matters because, like I said in the first module, electricity markets do not govern themselves. There has to be some form of governance in place. And without that, as you've rightly identified, there will be no investor confidence, no consumer protection, tariffs will be uncertain, lack of system reliability because there will be no standards in place to adhere to, and of course, no accountability. There will be discretionary behavior and with no one to hold accountable. So it's very important that the market is governed. Now, what is the legal architecture of electricity markets? So, like I said, the market is governed through a hierarchy of legal instruments. So at the highest level, you have the constitutional principles and primary legislation. So if you go to your constitution in your country, you would see the provision for, amongst other sectors, the provision of electricity. Then you have the primary legislation, which is the Electricity Act, or the nomenclature it is called in your country. So these establish the institutional mandates and regulatory powers. Then you have the secondary legislation, which provide operational detail, because we would see why the secondary legislation provides operational detail and why this cannot be in the primary legislation. So you have grid codes, market rules, licenses, commercial contracts that govern day-to-day market activities. So once you understand this, you'll be able to identify the legal basis for regulatory decisions. So when you see information that, oh, the government has introduced state electricity markets, you'll be able to go to the Constitution to see the remit of the state. Is it even permissible? You'll be able to look at the Electricity Act to see the bandwidth of those states. Can they go into, are they limited intrastate? Can they expand interstate, which is beyond the states? So it will help you identify the legal basis for regulatory decisions and resolve conflicts between different instruments. Let's look at this. So if you look at the bottom of the pyramid, you have primary. So all countries have a framework of regulation. You have the primary legislation for the sector. If you look at this arrow, it says there's increasing flexibility and speed of change. So as you move up this pyramid, the bottom layer is more of the principles, and then the details, operational details, go up the pyramid. So you have your secondary legislation, and there's increased flexibility and speed of change, which is why you see that some acts can be in place for 50 years, 60 years with no change. But if you look into the regulations, the rules, the codes, the directives, you will see that those can easily be changed. So there is a pyramid. And you need to understand that. So the government and the regulator, a lot of people mix up these stakeholders. They are two completely different stakeholders, and the misconception is that the government and regulators perform identical functions. They do not. They do not perform identical functions. The government determines policy priorities, they enact legislation, and oversee sector reform. The regulators, on the other hand, they apply the laws that have been enacted independently by licensing market participants, approving tariffs, monitoring compliance, they resolve disputes. So you can see that they perform completely different roles, and there's a need to maintain an appropriate balance between political oversight and regulatory independence in order to build long-term credibility. And so this is really important that you understand this. So what are the key institutions in the power sector? You have the electricity regulator, you have the ministry, which can be the energy ministry, depending on what it's called in your country, the power ministry, you have the utilities, the public and private, you have system and market operators who superintend the market, and then you have interaction between all these institutions. So they always tend to interact with one another. They tend to interact with one another. And then we then move to the electricity regulators. Like I said, they perform licensing functions, they approve tariffs, they monitor compliance, they protect consumers, and take enforcement and sanctions against erring market participants. In terms of regulatory independence, it's very important. Regulatory independence builds market credibility. It helps to attract investment. So if there's political interference, you are less likely to attract investment into the sector. Investors need to be confident that the regulator is independent and they're taking decisions independently. There needs to be transparency and consistency. And consistency is important because the regulator cannot in one breath change the tariffs, increase the tariffs, and then come back. I know this happened, I don't know if some of us remember, a while ago, I think that was in 2012, the regulator had increased the tariffs, but because of political interference in Nigeria, 2 days later, they came back and reversed it. That is not consistent. An investor will not invest based on that sort of behavior. So electricity markets have different structures. Electricity markets have different structures. And I'll go through them. I'll go through them with you so you understand. So it's not just one. So within a market, you can have different form or different structures operating within that market. So we'll look at those structures now. You have what we call vertically integrated utilities. I don't know if you've heard of that word before. Vertically integrated utilities. And what that means is that one company performs generation, transmission, distribution, and supply. Just one company. Now, although this allows for easier coordination and in smaller markets is more ideal, it limits competition. It distorts competition. And with this structure, there is a high risk of political influence because it's just one company. They can be easily influenced politically. You have the single buyer model, which is independent generators selling electricity to one central purchaser. So in Nigeria, remember we have the Nigerian bulk electricity trader. That is the central purchaser that buys electricity from various generators. And for it to do that, it has to enter into power purchase agreements with those generators, depending on how many they are. And then the government provides guarantee because the bulk purchaser most times is a government entity. So the government guarantees the bulk purchase of the electricity, which then presents what we call off-taker risk. What if the government is unable to take that power, to buy the power? What happens? So the single buyer model has its flaws. You have the competitive market. Here, generation companies compete. Consumers can choose their suppliers. This allows for competition, there's efficiency, innovation, because everybody's trying to outdo and outperform each other. But then it requires a lot of complex regulation. And then it needs a lot of institutional capacity because you're not dealing with so much competition. Then you have the hybrid market. So this is where most African countries are. There's some level of competition, some monopoly, and then reforms are ongoing. So for example, in Nigeria, you have the bulk electricity trader. Then you also have willing buyers and willing sellers. So it's hybrid. This is the hybrid market. So there's no universally best electricity market model. It depends on each country's circumstances. So depending on the market size, is there institutional capacity? What is the political economy like? The investment climate, do they have infrastructure? All those will determine the electricity market structure to adopt. Those will determine the electricity market structure to adopt. So I have a question. I just have a question. So let's look at this before I ask the question. So you can see vertically integrated, there's low competition. Typical countries, Ethiopia, single buyer model, medium competition, Kenya, Ghana, and they're even reforming. Then you have the competitive, which is high, UK, Australia, and the more advanced markets. And then hybrid, there's moderate competition, like in Nigeria. So electricity licenses, who needs licenses? Like I said, you cannot just wake up and build a power plant. Generation, at the point of generation, you need a license. At the point of transmission, you need a license. Distribution, supply, trading, mini grids. We'll talk about mini grids later. And storage in some jurisdictions, you need a license. Like in the UK, you need a license for storage. It may not, the bandwidth and the capacity may not be, the threshold won't be as high as what you'd require for generation, but then you still need a license. So the licensing journey varies. You put in your application, it's reviewed, and then there's a consultation before, and then sometimes they require that you publish your application so that you get a no objection, your license is granted, and then of course the regulator will keep monitoring your compliance level. You can see the NEC licensing process, which is also available online. Regulatory decision making, like I said, regulatory decision making is shifting from that traditional process into more robust stakeholder process. Now regulators are doing more, so there's what we call regulatory sandbox. They are doing more piloting, more testing to see the impact of regulation as opposed to the hard enforcement of regulation. That is shifting, especially with the rise of clean energy technologies. In Africa, there are a lot of regulatory challenges, political interference. Institutions are not strengthened, they are weak. Utilities are financially distressed. You would notice there was a recent in Nigeria. I use Nigeria because I'm from Nigeria and I understand, even though I understand other markets, but yeah, Nigeria is particularly dear to me. So you would see that recently the government rejected the World Bank grant and loan because we've taken on more than we can chew. And now the government, the sector is still illiquid, so we cannot pile on more debt. Utilities are financially distressed because tariffs are either not cost reflective or their capex is insufficient based on the regulatory threshold. Again, if you are a utility, there's a misconception that utilities are like normal companies. They're not, they're regulated. They have a model that the regulator uses to cap their capex, their return on investment. It is capped. If you overinvest beyond that cap, it means you're Father Christmas. So it's a highly regulated industry. Reforms are slow. There is regulatory uncertainty. 1 minute, the government is changing the goalpost, and the next minute is coming back. So there's regulatory uncertainty. So power sector governance is institutional. Regulation operates within legal limits, as I explained. Credible regulation depends on governance design. The design informs credibility. So I'll give a knowledge check. Which institution, you can put your answer in the chat, is primarily responsible for tariff approval in most electricity markets? Which institution? You can put your answer in the chat and I'll pick up on it. Which institution? You can put the letter. Thank you. You're all doing very well. It's the regulator. Thank you so much. Yes, thank you. So let's see, let's move on. So we're going to have a mini case discussion again. We use the chat. The government has frozen the tariffs during elections. Now the questions I ask are, should the regulator comply to that? Who will bear the cost? And what happens to investors? So please put your answers in the chat. Think through it. The government freezes tariffs during elections. Should the regulator comply? Who bears the cost? What happens to investors? You can put your answers in the chat or you can raise up your hand and we can take the discussion. Let's hear from you to see if we're all following. Yes, who bears the cost? Who I'm asking is a question. Who bears the cost? Okay, the regulator should not comply. Why? Chidima, you said the regulator should not comply. Why should the regulator not comply? And what would it be the impact if they do? Who will bear the cost? What happens to investors? So please. So our regulators ideally should be independent, of course. Thank you. Of government interference. Consumer bears the cost, yes, because remember I said the consumers finance the industry because the tariffs are what they use to pay and allow market participants recover their costs. What instrument? Exactly. What implement? Well, that's why we talked about political interference. It has happened before. In most African jurisdictions, governments can wake up and freeze the tariffs without any legislative backing. The regulator should be independent from political influence. No return on investment, consumers bear the cost. Regulator can contest such freeze order. Who do they contest it to? That's why it's very important from the onset to separate the functions. Yes, investors' appetite decreases depending on trade relations and contractual agreements. Investors can claim indirect expropriation, yes, for those who have already invested and have already built legitimate expectations around their investment. Judiciary comes in. That would be a tough call. But it's better from the onset to just separate, let each person perform their respective roles to avoid, because once the judiciary comes in, your investment perception goes down. Investors don't want to come in. It's just chaotic. So thank you for the answers. Thank you for those answers. Thank you. I will just move on. I'll just move on to I think, let me see what's next. Okay, so we're moving to the last module, which is tariffs, investment, and the energy transition. Tariffs, investment, and the energy transition. If you have any questions, please put it in the chat, and then it will be picked up subsequently. All right, we then move on. So I want you to also think of, we've talked about a lot of things. Political governance challenges like political interference, financially distressed utilities, capacity constraints of institutions, regulatory implementation is inconsistent. Now, this requires oftentimes institutional reform alongside legal reform because there needs to be a legal basis to address all these challenges. So think through your country, your power sector, identify governance challenges in your own jurisdiction, consider practical reforms. And this can even, remember in the last session, we talked about writing articles. You can carve it out as an article, write about it, or share your thoughts here while we move on to the next module. So module 3 is tariffs, investment, and the energy transition. So at the end, you'll be able to understand the fundamentals, tariff fundamentals, cost recovery. I'm sure you hear cost reflective tariffs. You find out what that means and the impact. Investment confidence, renewable integration, regulatory adaptation. Why do tariffs matter? Tariffs influence investment. They influence the viability of utilities. They determine how the cost of generating, transmitting, distributing, and supplying electricity are recovered. They determine consumer affordability and, of course, economic competitiveness. So tariffs that are appropriately designed will encourage investment. They would help to support maintenance and expansion of infrastructure and promote financial sustainability. Remember I said the utilities are regulated, even their capex is regulated. So if the tariffs are not cost reflective, it distorts their ability to put in investments in infrastructure. So you see that it has broad implications. Poorly designed tariffs undermine utilities, discourage investors, and they reduce service quality because you cannot invest when you cannot meet, when you don't have sufficient recovery of your investment. You can't invest in infrastructure. You are barely surviving. So what are electricity tariffs? Sorry, let's look at what are electricity tariffs. Electricity tariffs, it's just the rate, the price you pay per unit of electricity to your energy service provider or retailer. So the tariff it combines different things, rates, additional charges, and other rules. We will look at it. I'm going to explain it further down in the next slide. You will see what makes up the tariff, because it's not just made out of the blues. It has components. There are components in the tariff. The tariff are the prices paid by consumers. It has to be approved by the regulators, and it has to allow for cost recovery while balancing affordability and viability. So what makes up your tariff? If you look, you have, we call it, so the investors, the utilities have what they call allowed revenue. That is, remember I said it's highly regulated, so they even have an allowed revenue, how much they can earn. And it's made up of operating costs, capital costs, the initial capital cost, return on investment, plus depreciation and taxes. This will then give you the tariffs. And there is a model that is used to compute it. In Nigeria, it's called the multi-year tariff order, the MITRE model. It consists of all these parameters, and it is populated to produce the tariffs. So the tariffs are made up of these components. So when they ask you, do you know what tariffs are made of? You won't just say no, or you make up anything. These are the components of the tariffs. Cost reflective tariffs. We keep hearing cost reflective tariffs. It just means the true cost of generating, transmitting, and distributing electricity, and not any random figure. The actual cost, when you sit down and put up all those parameters I mentioned, what does it truly cost to generate, transmit, and distribute electricity? And it's very important because it has to allow recovery of efficient costs. It has to allow for network expansion, repayment of debt, and build investor confidence. Without cost-reflective tariffs, a government will not be able to attract investment. They cannot improve power supply because they can't even invest in the network. They can't expand the network. Now, it affects each and every one of us, because once there is a price hike, it can increase your cost of living. And remember, in remote areas, or what we call underserved and unserved, those that are connected to the grid, is very important that tariffs are cost reflective. But there are different customer classifications, and those who have affordability challenges they usually fall under what we call vulnerable customers or lifeline customers. It means their tariff rates are different. It's usually a low fixed sum compared to the other classes of customers, like where you have in Nigeria band A to E, and then you have other classifications in other countries. So affordability versus sustainability, this is something that always has to be balanced. It always has to be balanced. And this is one of the most difficult tasks of the regulator. Balancing affordability, can the customers afford it? And financial sustainability, can utilities retain and recover, and investors recover their costs? Is a very hard responsibility. So consumers require affordable electricity, investors require predictable revenue streams. Cost-reflective tariffs are often complemented by targeted subsidies. So you would have heard what they call cross-subsidization. What that does is it takes the high-end customers, we call them maximum demand customers, so the industries, the big companies, they pay higher so that those who cannot afford can pay lower. The subsidy is cross-subsidized, but it has to be targeted. You cannot just impose or put in place subsidies arbitrarily. You have to do a study. So when they are doing, so you may not have known, but there needs to be an affordability study. The government needs to undertake an affordability to ensure that study will inform who needs the subsidies, how much subsidies are needed, and so on. So Subsidies should not just be arbitrarily put in place, it has to be targeted. So cost-reflective tariffs are complemented by targeted subsidies, like I mentioned, social protection mechanisms to assist vulnerable customers. Electricity subsidies, like I mentioned, electricity subsidies, they have their advantages and they have their risks. So they ensure social protection so that vulnerable customers are protected. They allow for universal access, because if everyone can access electricity, then that is a plus. Improved affordability, because it allows for cross-subsidization. Once that happens, the vulnerable customers and those customers in service bands, it's now broken down based on affordability. Political acceptability. Of course, every government will want to show that they are considering the cost of power and its impact on the population. So it's politically acceptable. But then it presents a fiscal burden. It presents a fiscal burden. It distorts the market, because you have different price variations across different customer categories. If it's not targeted properly, it can create problems, and it discourages private investment. I mean, investors want to invest where they can create a trajectory that shows them how they will recover their investment. With subsidies, it doesn't encourage investment. Investment confidence. Investors seek stable. What do investors seek for? They look for stable regulatory environments that are characterized by predictable decision-making, not arbitrary. Predictable decision-making, enforceable contracts, where contracts are enforced and are not just on paper. Transparent tariff methodologies. The tariff methodologies have to be transparent. Effective dispute resolution. Disputes have to be resolved appropriately. Now, so electricity regulation plays a central role in determining whether investment capital is attracted to or diverted away from a market. So you can see that regulation is important. What do investors look for? As I said, stable regulation. Independent regulator that takes decision on their own with predictable decision making. Not one that can be politically influenced, not one that takes arbitrary decisions, one that is predictable. Bankable PPAs, power purchase agreements that you can take to the bank. Payment security, then the investor look for payment security so that in the event of any default on the part of let's say between a seller and a buyer under a PPA, there is some form of security or cushion that will take care of that payment. Because remember that most of them will have financial obligation to lenders, and they want to avoid triggering the lender step-in rights. The lender step-in rights is triggered when the buyer is unable to meet his financial obligations, and then the lender then steps in as if they are the party to the contract, so that they can recover their loan or financial obligation. And then investors look for rule of law, which essentially speaks to the resolution of disputes. How quickly are disputes resolved? What is the judicial system in place? How do the courts operate, timelines, etc. Those are things investors look out for. We'll talk briefly about power purchase agreements. What is a power purchase agreement? Simple. It's just an agreement between an energy buyer and an energy producer. The buyer agrees to purchase electricity from the seller at a pre-agreed price over a defined period, and typically between 20 to 25 years. But with clean energy technologies, you have shorter PPAs, because you have things like virtual PPAs, slipped PPAs. So you can see those ones for a duration of around 5 years or even less. So power purchase agreements, they allow for revenue certainty, because then you know that your power has an off-taker. They allow risks to be spread, and they secure long-term investment. Now, what are investment risks that can be experienced in the power sector? You have political risk, which is a major risk, especially in Africa. You have currency risk. You know, in some cases, I've had cases where the power purchase agreement is denominated in maybe naira or in dollar, but then, or for example, tariffs are denominated in Nigeria, tariffs are denominated, we use our currency naira, but utilities have equipment suppliers that denominate their contracts in dollars, or even the power purchase agreement. So you can see there's a currency risk, because what if there is a currency devaluation or an issue? It would affect, and sometimes they are unable to pass through that cost to the consumer. They are unable to pass through. It might not be a pass-through cost. So that is a challenge. Payment risk. If you don't have a credible off-taker, you will not get paid for the power. Construction risk. There may be delays with construction, which will impact the project. You have regulatory risks, change in regulation, change in law, etc. And of course, force majeure, events beyond the control of parties, which can also affect investments. So renewable energy, I'll talk briefly. I won't go into the detail. You can just undertake research regarding some of these areas. And I'm sure you would have heard, or you should be familiar with a few of them as well. A few of them as well should be familiar to you. You have solar. So when we say renewable energy, we talk about replenishable energy. Energy that is renewable, you can replenish it. So the sun, for example, it will shine day on day, except in certain seasons. The wind, there are certain areas where you have higher wind speed. Hydro, if you have the dams, it's replenishable. It's water, it's replenishable. Battery storage is also replenishable because you can replenish the battery life. Mini grids, most mini grids use renewable energy, so it's replenishable. And then you have distributed energy resources. Distributed energy resources really includes things like rooftop solar, battery storage, electric vehicles, mini grids, etc. We'll see that as we go along. So yes, here it is. So you have electric vehicle demand response microgrids. Is essentially what it is, distributed energy. So you know the traditional energy systems had large power stations, then you had transmission, distribution, and the consumer. But the future electricity system, we as consumers will become producers, we will become consumers, we will provide storage, we will be grid participants, and that's what is called prosumer. We would consume and we will produce. So these distributed energy resources will allow for improved resilience. It will reduce transmission losses because now you have so many distributed energy resources. Consumers can increase their choice as to who their supplier is, or you can even be your own supplier. It will improve energy access and it supports decarbonization. But of course, it also has its challenges from the angle of looking at things like grid access. I don't know if we're familiar with the net billing, net metering framework. And of course, there are interconnection standards. So if you want to connect locally, regionally, there are standards in place. You can't just connect your system into another country or another state. There are rules in place. You have to consider the safety consideration. You have to look at consumer protection. And of course, a very key area, digitalization, cybersecurity. You know, I told you electricity sector is moving from that conventional and traditional sector to one that is extremely digitized. So we then look at why regulation must change, and I just spoke to most of this, because you know, old regulation cannot accommodate new technology. And to accommodate the new technology, you need new market rules, The grid needs to be modernized to accommodate renewable energy sources which are intermittent, because obviously the sun doesn't shine at all times, wind speeds vary, but old regulation cannot accommodate new technology. It's like they say, you cannot put new wine in old wineskin. So the new power grid that would accommodate renewable energy, smart homes, artificial intelligence, digitization, there needs to be new regulation, new rules that will accommodate this. And beyond the rules, the actual infrastructure has to be upgraded. There needs to be modernization of the grid to accommodate the new wave of the power sector. So we've had energy transition. I'm sure a lot of us have energy transition. What is this energy transition? It is what it is. It's the transition of the energy sector. It speaks to decarbonization, which is transforming electricity regulation worldwide. We're now moving towards more cleaner energy sources. The need to decarbonize, defossilize, the need to shift to cleaner energy sources. And because of this, we're seeing an increasing deployment of renewable energy, battery storage, distributed energy resources, as I mentioned, electric vehicles, digital technologies. So this then requires modernized legal frameworks and market rules. Electricity regulation, think of it that is no more limited to monopoly oversight. It increasingly facilitates innovation, but it still has to preserve system reliability. So the energy transition is what is ongoing, and it's a journey. It will keep going. I'm sure you've heard of net zero, Paris Agreement, climate targets, climate policies. The energy transition is an advocate for these objectives. So in Africa, we have several challenges with our transition. The capacity of the grid. A lot of countries are even struggling to meet the demand. Finance is a limiting factor. We need sufficient private investment, but the private investors will only come in when the regulatory environment is stable. So it's a tricky one. Affordability for unserved and unserved consumers, regulatory capability, the regulators have the capacity to handle what the expectations of the energy transition, and then institutional capacity needs to be built. Institutional capacity needs to be built to accommodate the transition. So what are the key takeaways? Tariffs are legal decisions. So while they are legal decisions because they're entrenched in the law, a pricing failure can result in the failure of the entire sector. Compliance underpins credibility. Compliance not just with regulatory requirements, but even on a consumer level. Electricity regulation is no longer limited to monopoly oversight, like I mentioned. It has to facilitate innovation whilst preserving system reliability. And modernized legal frameworks and market rules are required to align with global decarbonization objectives. So let's check ourselves. Why are electricity tariffs considered regulatory decisions rather than purely technical calculations? Remember, I mentioned it's not just about calculating. Why are they considered regulatory decisions? Put your answer in the chat, please. Put your answer in the chat. Thank you. And for you to know the current tariff in your jurisdiction, you would need to go to the electricity regulator's website. The tariffs will be there because it will be based on, for example, in Nigeria, service bands. So there's no one single tariff, and it's the regulator that designs the tariffs. Please put your answer. Why are tariffs considered regulatory decisions rather than purely technical calculations? Your answer in the chat. I will look through. Yeah, let's see. I'm just giving a few minutes so everyone has the opportunity. Okay, let me see. So this is C. Okay, good. Let me move this so I can see. Okay, so yes, the answers are coming in. I'll let you know the right answer. Just giving some time. So 1 minute, let me give 2-3 minutes so that we can discuss about it. 1 or 2 minutes. Put your answers in the chat, please. Put your answers in the chat. Yes, I can see more answers, and I'm seeing a common thread, but would talk about it once we're done. Okay, a minute more. A minute more. Okay, I think we can proceed. I think we can proceed. So yes, the answer is C, because the balance are considered regulatory decisions because they balance cost reflectivity, cost recovery, affordability, and policy objectives. Thank you for your excellent feedback. Let's move on. So these are points. Let me just see what's next. Okay. I think I will take the closing, then we'll come back to the discussion so that people can share their views. So electricity markets require specialized legal and regulatory frameworks, like I mentioned. Effective institutions are fundamental to market performance. Tariff design directly influences investment and affordability. Regulation is critical to enabling the energy transition. It cannot happen on its own. Electricity law is ultimately about balancing public interest with commercial sustainability. And good regulation is not about controlling markets. It's about creating the conditions in which markets, investors, utilities, and consumers can all succeed by balancing competing objectives. So we'll take some of the discussion points and then we'll go into Q&A. You can type in the chat while I look through the chat as well to answer any questions. So I see a question. And that it says you said electricity cannot be stored and needs to be dispatched as quickly as it is produced, meaning that supply and demand needs to be balanced in real time. Yes. Can we consider BESS, which is battery energy storage systems, as a system of storage, especially if they are grid connected and used for ancillary purpose? So the answer is yes, because traditionally electricity has been difficult and expensive to store at grid scale. But with advances in energy storage technologies, particularly grid connected BESS, this is changing a lot of things. So, but irrespective, power system operators are still required to maintain real-time balance between supply and demand, because storage capacity remains finite and it requires active, it's not just a case of saying, no, we have storage. It requires active management. It has to be managed actively. So BESS, battery energy storage systems, complement rather than eliminate the need for real-time system balancing. They don't eliminate it. It's just complementary. It's like filling a gap. It just complements real-time real-time management of the grid. Okay, let me see. So it doesn't remove the need. So I'll say BESS, it doesn't remove the need for real-time balancing. So even though it stores electricity, the system operator has a responsibility to balance supply and demand continuously. And this is because batteries, they have limited energy capacity. So capacity is measured depending in megawatts, megawatt hours, kilowatts. They have limited energy capacity, batteries. So their charge and discharge rates have a cap. They have maximum charge and discharge rate. So you see, you cannot just use them as the sole source. They eventually become fully charged or fully discharged. And then they cannot compensate indefinitely for supply-demand imbalances. So when there is an imbalance in supply and demand, the battery cannot compensate for that. It's just another dispatchable resource that the system operator can use to maintain system balance. It's not a replacement. It's just another dispatchable resource. So I hope that answers that question. Let me see the chat and then I'll take more questions. So there's another one. The need to be innovative with the capacity of accommodating new or emerging technologies. Which comes first, investment or regulations? So neither comes first. But in practice, they both evolve together. So regulation and investment evolve together. But the sequencing will depend on the technology. How you would sequence it to say which comes first will depend on the technology, the market, and the level of innovation. So in the past, you would see that regulation has preceded major investment, and understandably so. You have the policy, the law, the regulation, then you have investment, then infrastructure. So before a private investor will commit hundreds of millions of dollars, they will expect there to be a legal framework, licensing regime, a tariff methodology, system rules, and of course, dispute resolution framework. But as we are moving, as the industry is moving, innovation often comes first because technological innovation is moving faster than regulation. Innovation, so you notice these days that the innovation would come first, then the regulation will come after. So even battery energy storage system, like I mentioned, electric vehicles, because innovation is moving faster. Those days, you needed to regulate first. But now, there's so many technologies coming out. People are being so innovative. The innovation vehicle to grid, you have peer-to-peer electricity trading, artificial intelligence in grid management. Virtual power plants are now in place. You don't need to physically connect the power plants. Green hydrogen is emerging. You have blockchain. There's so many. So now what we're now seeing is the technology, then the investment, then the regulatory adaptation. So regulators are now forced to adopt and to respond because the laws that are in place, they were not designed to accommodate these technologies. They didn't even know that these technologies will come in mind. And there are more to come that we cannot even imagine. So if we decide to wait for regulation, you can imagine what will happen. Things will be so slow if regulation has to come first. That old system has moved on to a new system where innovation is now ahead of regulation. So, for example, in many jurisdictions, early battery projects were deployed before electricity legislation, especially like storage as a distinct regulated activity. So at that time, the regulators then had to now decide, is storage generation, then it's just now, even now, storage can be many things. It can be generation, it can be transmission, it can be distribution, it can even be a separate asset class. So what we're seeing is what we call co-evolution. It's called regulatory co-evolution. So instead of asking which one comes first, I would say, how can regulation evolve alongside innovation without either one stifling investment or creating unacceptable risks? It's now co-evolution that we are witnessing. So now the regulators are then faced with the challenge of, if they delay regulation, like I mentioned, innovation will be slow. And you cannot delay innovation. It's almost like, it's like your mind, when you're thinking of something, you just want to get it out. Innovation will be delayed. Investments will move elsewhere. Consumers will miss out on new technology. But if regulation is too fast, you may base the rules on immature technology. The technology has not developed sufficiently for you to put in place those rules. You may design poor regulation, which will lock in inefficient outcome because you are the regulation is too fast. Investors may face uncertainty because the rules will change frequently. Remember, because it's too fast, you would have to keep adapting to the technology. So investors may be uncertain. So we now need to start thinking towards adaptive regulation. I mentioned regulatory sandboxes. This is where things like that come in. Piloting regulatory projects, regulatory sandboxes, testing regulation, putting in place technology neutral legislation so that it accommodates. That's one thing we try to do with the Nigerian Electricity Act, because I worked on that act. Try to make it more technology neutral because it will keep new technologies we've not heard of will come up. Do you then amend the law? So you have to be very innovative. Then you have to be prescriptive. You have to be principle-based rather than prescriptive. So that way you allow for innovation, you adapt, you accommodate new technologies. So you should be thinking, should regulation lead innovation, or should it create the conditions for innovation to emerge? That's how I want us to think about it. So good regulation should neither lag behind innovation nor race ahead of it. That's my own thinking. His role is to create a credible framework within which innovation and investment can flourish while protecting the interest of the public. So I don't know if we've taken on, I hope this answers that. I don't know if we've taken on the answers. Okay, PPA is between private parties regulated by NEC. NEC does not, because it's a bilateral transaction, it's bilateral. NEC does not regulate private PPAs, but PPAs between MBET and the relevant generators are regulated because of pricing. But you would have to inform, remember, if you are an investor coming in, you would require that there is a PPA in place to show that you have a credible off-taker, to show that your investment is secure and there is a credible off-taker. So those PPA don't need to be regulated by NEC or the regulator. Are tariffs based on what the laws say? No, tariffs are regulated. I mentioned that in one of the modules. There is a framework in every country. There's a framework that governs tariffs. So let's see if there are any questions. If you have questions, you can raise up your hand. I've spoken about this, and that brings us to the end. I will stop sharing so that we can take on any questions. So if you have questions, please, let me just put it in the chat box. Put it in the chat, and then I'll take the questions. But I think I've addressed most of the questions already. I hope, and I'll wait for more. Let me look at the Q&A. Okay. Thank you all. I'm just giving a few minutes to take any more questions. I hope I've answered everyone's question, and I'm going through the chat. Yes, that's NEC licensees if you are licensed by NEC. But if you are a private, if it's a willing buyer, if you're not a NEC licensee, you do not need to file, and it's not for approval, it's for notification. NEC cannot determine the terms of your contract. Uzoma, I'm just reading you. NEC remember, they have to uphold the sanctity of contract. What NEC will be looking out for, they're not bothered about the terms of the contract, is the pricing. The pricing is what they are bothered about, because if you are a NEC licensee, then you are somewhat regulated. So they want to ensure that the price is affordable, but yet allows you to recover your investment. So they don't need to approve it. You don't need to notify them, and they just want to ensure that the terms are balanced between both parties. But in terms of the enforceability of the contract, that cannot be on NEC, because it's a contract. It's between two parties. NEC is not a party to the contract. Thank you all. Chidera, thank you. Glad to have you here. I'm glad to have you. Thank you all for coming. If you have any further questions, put it in the chat. Please continue to follow the Academy for future courses. This masterclass has provided the foundation. So understanding electricity regulation is increasingly important for lawyers. If you attended the last session, policymakers, consultants, investors, engineers, development practitioners. So as electricity systems become more decentralized, digitized, and decarbonized, the quality of legal and regulatory design will increasingly determine whether countries achieve reliable, affordable, and sustainable electricity systems. And the masterclass has provided the foundation for that understanding. Your participants, we encourage you to continue your learning. through the Electricity Law Academy's advanced programs on electricity market regulation, power purchase agreements, distributed energy resources, and energy transition governance. Some of these courses are not listed on the Academy's website, but if you go to the book a course and you put in the bespoke course, you can book a bespoke course. But for now, we're only accepting organizational bookings because it has to be a minimum of 10 participants. So you can book a bespoke course, and that would allow us to train you. We have a lot of other faculties that can provide training that will allow you to be trained. Our advanced courses are at a fee, but the basic ones we just provide for free to give an understanding, at least this one. Yes. So thank you. Somebody said South Africa is changing from, hold on, let me get that. I can see properly, yep. So South Africa is changing. Okay, thank you. South Africa, I want to read it. South Africa is changing from vertically integrated market to a liberalized market with the introduction of SAWEM. SAWEM is the South African wholesale electricity market as a key reform. However, my concern is we are moving from a monopoly through Eskom and what now resembles an oligopoly in the renewable energy sector through IPPs, with very few players from South Africa, where most of these emerging IPPs are struggling to reach financial close. What is your view on that? So, liberalization does not automatically create competition. That's the first thing you need to understand. Liberalization does not automatically, you can have, so we often think that it's monopoly, then liberalization, then competition. It doesn't necessarily have to be so. You can have state monopoly, private oligopoly. You can have state monopoly, private oligopoly, or even a mix of it doesn't have to be the monopoly, liberalization, competition. So Eskom, Eskom is a very, when I'm studying utilities, Eskom is one of the utilities I study because they are very interesting and they've been through so many issues, restructurings. So Eskom, you know, was responsible for generation, transmission, distribution to an extent, and system operation. Including, and then now we have the South African wholesale electricity market, which now seeks to separate competitive activities from monopolistic activities and introduce multiple generators, and of course, ultimately create a wholesale competitive market. And these are good objectives, but market liberalization alone will not and cannot guarantee a diverse market structure. It will not guarantee a diverse market structure. And in terms of your oligopoly concern, it is valid because if only a small number of IPPs dominate, then you have several risks that will emerge. So you have market power being concentrated in certain players. There's reduced competitive pressure because they've taken over, dominated. Barriers to entry. Others cannot enter because it's almost like they've distorted the market entry. Then there will only be a handful of financially strong developers, and then it may impact pricing. And then what you then see is that South African firms, like you rightly mentioned, there are not a lot of them even being involved. They will be unable to compete with international firms that have lower financing costs or stronger balance sheets, or those that even have established relationship with DFIs. So although competition exists in theory in this scenario, in practice, it will be limited. And then when we talk about the issue of financial close, in your last point where you say IPPs, most of these emerging IPPs are struggling to reach financial close. Yes, because bankability depends on more than just winning the procurement. You have barriers like limited equity capital, insufficient development funding, the lender's risk perception. The cost of capital may also be expensive. Their balance sheet may be weak. They may have limited collateral. The transaction cost may be high. The procurement process may be lengthy. So, in terms of this risk, large international developers, unfortunately, they have advantages in all these areas. It's just what it's unfortunate, but it's the reality. So procurement can become competitive at the bidding stage, but concentrated at financial close. So these other developers who this risk affects do not stand a chance. So sometimes it's not that it's more favorable to one sect as opposed to the other. And liberalization should not be measured by the number of licenses. The number of licenses does not determine the competitiveness of markets. What you should be thinking of is who owns and finances these generation assets. If it is concentrated amongst a handful of firms, the market may exhibit oligopolistic characteristics, even if there is liberalization. So what South Africa should be looking at, and other African markets, which is a big gap, is there has not been enough attention paid to building domestic market participants. They are not paying enough attention to building domestic market participants, and that they often focus on attracting, we focus more on attracting investment, increasing generation capacity, reducing our fiscal burden. But equal attention needs to be given to developing local developers, improving access to project development finance. We need to strengthen our domestic EPC capability. If you look around Africa, you will see that this is very low, very poor. We need to support local capital markets, facilitate local ownership. In Nigeria, we have people who like solar manufacturing. We have just maybe one. And then we have researchers who are now putting in place research projects to increase that capacity. We should be increasing the capacity. If not, we risk dependence on foreign capital without building domestic industrial capacity. And that cycle will keep going on, and then we miss out. So this is where regulation becomes more than tariff setting. The regulator now has to look beyond just setting tariffs. How does regulation promote fair competition? How does it promote non-discriminatory grid access, transparent procurement, efficient market entry, innovation and participation by smaller market actors? This is where the regulator comes in. I know in the UK, when they are doing their auction system, they have rules for the different categories of generators, those who are producing on a large scale, those who are producing either maybe storage, BESS, and the market is in such a way that you cannot hinder anyone. Even if I'm a battery storage participant, the rules allow me to participate, obviously to a certain threshold and capacity, but the rules have been set in such a way that it encourages investment across the board. It doesn't hinder, it doesn't limit. There are caps, there are rules. So battery energy storage has a capacity threshold, but within that your threshold, the market is fair. So regulation and policy has to protect local developers, and measures need to be put in place. That's why you have local content requirements, local equity participation, project development facilities, capacity building. We need to build more capacity and build our local capacity. If we continue, we would discourage our local industrial capacity, and domestic firms will not become competitive. So South Africa's reform, it shouldn't be judged solely by whether Eskom's monopoly is reduced. That's not the sole factor, but by whether it creates a competitive, resilient, and inclusive electricity market. That's the word I was looking for. Inclusive. Inclusive that allows all players to come in without hindering anyone from entering into the market. That is what the focus should be on. So South Africa should not think of it solely as a transition from monopoly to competition. No. It should think of it as a transition from centralization to market diversity. So I hope that answers your questions. So Uzama, you say all market participants. Of course, you have to get a license. You have to secure your license from NEC, but we have private participants. That's what I'm trying to. So like if I'm a captive generator, a maximum demand on industrial, and I want to sell my power to someone, I don't need to go to NEC, depending on the threshold. And the regulation provides for that. Or I might just need a permit. In that case, why should NEC be viewing my PPA? So it depends on, like I said, the threshold, the nature of the capacity. The capacity will determine if you need to be licensed or not. The capacity will determine what type of license, authorization, or permit you need to get. That same capacity, depending on your permit authorization, will determine the extent to which NEC can even be notified about your contractual arrangement. Are there specific technical and commercial terms that are condition precedent in a PPA? I know it depends on the parties and is more commercial. It's more commercial that are usually conditions precedents. Also, so Nigerian wholesale electricity market, yes, it is wholesale. It's also because you have MBET as your single buyer, and then you have the willing buyer, willing seller, eligible customer arrangement. But yes, MBET is still in the picture due to its subsisting contract. The Act provides that after a while, it will novate and transfer its contracts accordingly directly to the parties. But it will be interesting to see how this will play with the state electricity markets, considering the jurisdictional split between federal, intrastate, and state, interstate. It will be interesting to see. But I imagine that by then, MBET, because MBET, I think they're trying to transition into a full trading company. That is what they're trying to do. So with that, they should be able to trade within the federal market and possibly, depending on the legal framework of the state, possibly within the states, if the states don't already establish their own trading exchange or trading platform. In a situation where we have independent electricity distribution network companies registered by a state regulatory commission, and the existing DISCO refuses to work with such IEDN despite the fact that the DISCO is not supplying us energy to the states, what can be done? First of all, remember that when the states create their electricity markets, the DISCOs they will be required to create subcos. They will need to register subcos. It is those subcos that will then be transacting with the relevant participants. So, for example, it is going to change the dynamics, and that's something I always highlight. For a DISCO because it's now states, before you had Benin DISCO covering so many states, Enugu DISCO covering so many states, all that is going to change. It's going to be limited to each state. So that subco within that state will have to transact with the relevant parties, whether it's IDN or not. The subco would have to transact with those parties, and those, depending on the state regulation and legislation, those private participants will also be permitted to transact with other parties. State Electricity Regulatory Commission. Yes, I think I just spoke to that. It gives power states to legislate regarding the electricity. Remember, the Constitution placed a limitation on the states. It did not place a limitation for them to undertake the activities. So I always tell people, the states by the Constitution before the amendments, they could generate, transmit, distribute. What it created, the cap was, they did not have the legislative power to do that. So the constitutional amendment has allowed them to do that. And remember, before it was limited to the national grid, but the scope has now been expanded. So now states, once you put in place the policy, create the law, establish your state regulator, obviously you go through the transition process with NEC, notify NEC, they will issue the order, and you go through the transition phase before you fully set up your market. And once you do that, you then need to put in place the relevant prerequisites for the electricity market and operate within your state, interstate, operate within your state. I hope that answers the question on state electricity markets. Okay, thank you all. We are coming to the end of this session and this masterclass. Thank you for your participation, your attentiveness. Please feel free to connect with us, the Academy, or myself on LinkedIn. If you have any further questions, please send a message to me. I would always respond. It may not be immediate, but I will respond. Because it's a free masterclass, we're not giving out the recordings. We usually don't give out the recordings of our programs, but please feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions, and I will take it offline. You can send me a message on LinkedIn, connect with me, and send a message. Thank you all so very much. We would continue to reach out with our future programs. There is a webinar coming up on Wednesday, tomorrow. Please join, because that will be talking about a larger topic around building Africa's energy ecosystem, building Africa's clean energy, let me use the right word, clean energy ecosystem. So please join. So you have from regulation to industrial delivery, building Africa's clean energy ecosystem. If you haven't registered, please do well to register and join. And I will be also delivering a lecture to about 100 UNILAG students, focusing on project permitting and Nigeria's energy sector legal framework from concept to commissioning. You can look out on my page for that if you want to join the session. The organizers can possibly share the link. Thank you all so much. Please connect on LinkedIn. I will respond to connection requests. Thank you so much, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon, morning, or evening, wherever you have joined from. Thank you, and have a good day. The host, please, you can end the masterclass. Thank you all. Thank you all. Well done. Thank you.